And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is Nathan Newman. Nathan Newman is the director of a newly announced organization entitled Data Justice, and the slogan is challenging rising exploitation and economic inequality from big data, which is right up our alley. He is a lawyer and PhD. He has an extensive background in activism and as an associate counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, as well as in the academic world. So, Nathan Newman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with this. You've written a couple pieces that are timely in terms of what's going on in the news this month and even this week, but let's start with what is Data Justice. Tell us a little bit about that organization and how it came to be, if you would.
Sure. Data Justice is looking at the issue of big data, not just from the privacy aspect, where there's been at least some activism looking at how people are feeling a lot of surveillance out there, but we're also looking at the issue of how does so much data in the hands of so few corporations affect the fundamental issue of, is the economic system fairly being run when the companies know more about you than you know about them? And, you know, the bottom line answer is it's not going to end up being very fair. The bargaining, whether in the workplace or, you know, as a consumer or getting financial support, is not going to be on an even balance. And so that's what we're trying to look at, pulling together the data, research, and sort of public education to talk about these issues.
Well, it's something that's right up our alley here. You know, I've written a little bit about some very related topics myself, and we've had guests on, Frank Pasquale and others. So it's certainly one that, in my experience, the opportunity for exploitation and misuse is great, but the public awareness of the risks seems to me to be lagging behind the risks themselves. Would you say that's a fair description?
I'd both say it's true, but you also shouldn't be surprised, since it's very hard for people to anticipate how their data might be misused when the data is collected. Most of the companies collecting it don't know how it's going to be used. They figure that out later, and then long after people have given up that data, it's used in ways people didn't know, didn't expect, and probably wouldn't have approved of.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I got asked the question the other day, do I think they're really being malignant, I guess was the word the questioner was using, in their designs for this data, or just being opportunistic as they go. And I said, I'm not sure that in terms of end results, there's always a distinction, but I'd be curious to know about your thoughts on that. I totally agree that I think a lot of the tech companies are making it up as they go along, but what should people be concerned about when it comes to the use of big data?
I think your distinction is useful, because there are the companies out there, especially some of the predatory lenders, the subprime folks, who definitely use this data to find the folks they could exploit to dump bad mortgages on, exploitive practices, and they're the sort of most bottom-feeding folks who use this in a purely and consciously malignant way. But they're in some ways the less interesting and less important part of the story, since it's the folks who they just have, as they'd say, a disruptive business model, is how they'd probably say it in Silicon Valley. But the disruption is to all of the basic consumer protections that actually make sure people aren't exploited in the marketplace. And they just sort of, as they like to say, government is a malfunction that they route around. I mean, there's all this kind of rhetoric out there, but the bottom line result is people end up giving away their data at a price far less than its value, and used by everybody from advertisers to insurance companies in ways that make sure they get worse deals. And this is in some ways starts to look like the normal functioning of the marketplace. So if you're going to say it's malignant, you're saying that the normal functioning of the marketplace is malignant. So the distinction starts to become harder when you have just sort of the normal use of the data, in a sense.
Yes, I think that's an interesting answer. We're talking with Nathan Newman, director of the newly formed organization Data Justice, which can be found, I believe, at datajustice.org. Yep. And
Yep.
there's, I wouldn't expect you to have read my own writings on this topic, but you're a man after my own heart because certainly my sense is that that is correct. I basically agree with everything you've said, and I think that this can follow different pathways, whether it's charging different people different amounts for the same product online. Let's say one possible misuse, I would call that a misuse, to let's say Facebook altering the information you receive about your social community and about the world on a daily basis or hourly basis in order to maximize your likelihood of purchasing a product. Now, to the extent to which they do that, we don't really know, but we do know they manipulate the news feed, and I consider that disturbing because I don't know if you agree, but I feel that's almost altering people's awareness of the world for profit, and even if they don't mean it in a kind of even if they don't have some sort of sci-fi dystopian objective, it's still not a good thing in my book.
I think that's accurate. I think it goes to a broader problem that we're seeing sort of the nature of the internet, which was once a sort of set of processes that people organized as they found useful to themselves in a open way into what some people call closed gardens, or what you could call corporate controlled gardens, where the rules of the game aren't decided by the individuals involved, but by the companies that have nearly monopoly control. So, you can't find your friend somewhere else because everybody's in one place with what people in the economic field call network effects, which sort of lock in these closed gardens. And I think that's the disturbing part, and part of what today's action in the European Union going after Google is one example, where you have these companies that are so dominant, your sense of the world almost inevitably is shaped by these dominant companies.
Now, it's a good segue because I was going to bring that up. You published a piece this week because as our listeners may know, the European Competition Commissioner has launched an official antitrust action against Google, and you write that's likely to be just the first step in a likely escalation of actions against Google. Let's talk about this for a second. Nathan Newman, you're an attorney, and you understand the history of regulation and law in this country. I guess we should talk about the substance of the lawsuit against Google, but first a kind of contextual question. Whatever happened to the pursuit of antitrust in this country? For seemingly a century or so, it was an understood aspect of public policy, and it seems to me now that, especially where big tech is concerned, that governments of both parties have lost much interest ever since the last Microsoft suit, have lost much interest in pursuing antitrust. Is that a misperception on my part, you think?
No, I think there's been, especially since the 1970s, an escalating abandonment of antitrust as a tool for regulatory reform and restraining economic concentration. And shockingly, we've seen a massive increase of economic concentration since they cut back antitrust. It was almost a cause and effect, since companies knew they could buy any other company, escalate any kind of deal that was anti-competitive, and there was pretty good assurance that they wouldn't be stopped. And you've seen that with whether it's Google, Facebook, or many other companies outside of even the tech field having increasing concentration.
Right, absolutely. And it seems to me that, and I've written this, but it seems to me, Nathan Newman, that the tech model, the Silicon Valley model in particular now, seems to be give something away for free, market it aggressively, seek to get major, as close to a monopolistic market share as you can get, and then monetize it. And whether it's Uber, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's Amazon, whether it's, that the idea is get your Facebook is another, get your market share and then exploit the hell out of it. And given that, unless you disagree, the announcement today from the Europeans is specifically, as I understand it, but fill me in, that Google is using its dominant share of the search market to advantage its own advertisers. Correct?
Well, it's sort of interesting. There were two separate announcements today. The first, they were being targeted specifically, and this is where the European Commission had been looking for a while, is when you search for a product on Google, you will inevitably, the first few sites will be Google's own services trying to either sell it to you or direct you to people who are allied with Google. And the argument there is Google is using its dominance of search to help expand its dominance of the related shopping services, e-commerce. That's the first part. But the second part they announced, which is in some ways more interesting because it hadn't been quite as signaled, is they've opened a separate probe into Google's dominance of its Android operating system and how it used that to force manufacturers to include its various apps and services on the Google platform. And there was actually a third signal, and this was just in the last week, that the head of the competition authority in Europe said, and on top of these other probes that we're doing right now, they're opening and looking more specifically at how companies' control of user data helps reinforce their monopoly. And that they sort of made clear that that wasn't going to be the direct part of this first set of probes, but that the rest is coming. So what's interesting about today's announcement is this was all treated as this is just the opening, not the end product of their investigation. So this is likely to be a series of analyses of how the high-tech economy works and what's really needed for regulation to make it work for consumers. And, you know, in contrast to the U.S., where the regulators have taken a complete pass, Europe seems to be really engaging with what a 21st century antitrust law really needs to look like.
Now, there are those, we're talking with Nathan Newman, Director of Data Justice, there are those who say, predictably perhaps, they've already said it, in the U.S., well, you know, the Europeans, they're just jealous because we're so great at technology and they wish they had, you know, all those tech campuses in their countries with, you know, the waterfalls and you can bring your dogs to work and stuff. So it's just jealousy. I take it you don't agree with that. And what do you think is the underlying ethos here behind Europe's action? Is it the dominance? Is it classic antitrust, or is it antitrust plus a concern for the deeper social implications of having people's mediation with the world be influenced by a few small companies?
Well, I mean, I think there's many different things. Inevitably, when regulators finally act, there's usually a combination of factors. There's been a lot of debate in Europe over privacy protections that have been in many ways more vigorous than in the U.S. There's been definite concern over what they see as a certain form of U.S. economic imperialism, of companies coming in, you know, taking over areas, not paying taxes, not providing jobs, not doing most of the things that economic activity should do, which is not protectionism, but saying, are these companies following the rules of the road? And then thirdly, there is, as I said, this real worry about what is happening in this economy. And, you know, you have companies who fully are supporting this, like Germany, which has been, you know, very strong economically. They don't really have to worry. You know, if anything, they have an export surplus compared to most countries. But there is the worry about, is this an economy that's treating folks fairly in a way that delivers, you know, the products of this online economy to the rest of the sort of population? And that's, I think, a much deeper question, because you have to look at the fact that the rise of sort of big data online economy for all everybody celebrates it, has coincided with a generation when average incomes have completely stagnated. Most of the returns of productivity have gone exclusively to the very wealthy. And you've got to question, what is the role of this technology in driving that very amount of economic stagnation for most people and inequality across the economy? And I think that's something a number of folks, both in the U.S. and Europe, are really very worried about.
And this inequality could be driven by several factors, presumably including what came to be known for a while as the mechanical Turk economy, where Amazon would parcel out piecework on the internet, or now come to be called the sharing economy, and Uber, and now the buzzwords in the Silicon Valley, and Uber for running errands and an Uber for groceries and so on. So that might be part of it. Plus this is what comes to mind for me, but fill in more. Plus, of course, the enormous accumulation of wealth to a few individuals from overvalued companies and so on. Any other ways in which this might drive inequality?
Well, I mean, and I think the sort of piecemeal work goes to the way that information can coordinate jobs around when we talk about globalization, that's sometimes said, globalization has driven economic inequality. Well, globalization's always been there. We've always traded all over. But what's different is you can break up workplaces, send jobs to 20 different sites, and use information technology to coordinate it. That's one way information has been used. And the Uber model of breaking it up into, 10,000 separate taxi cabs, all supposedly working for themselves, is just the extreme example of that. You also have in the marketplace where every time you negotiate a deal, whether it's on insurance, a loan, your job, just buying a product online, the companies online know more about what you want and what you're willing to pay. And so they make sure they offer you the highest price possible that you are willing to pay. And that inevitably moves more of money into their hands. And so you have that sort of what I'd call the bargaining surplus all going to those. And then you have to, I've mentioned the subprime mortgage problem, but when you had the largest destruction of middle-class wealth happening because of the subprime mortgage crisis, and so much of that was driven by data-driven analysis, whether it was how the finance system itself worked to finding the victims who they could dump these bad mortgages on. There is a whole series of ways in which data-driven analysis has sort of put the proceeds of wealth into the hands of those who had the most, and had the downsides of that economy put into the hands of those who could afford it the least.
Well, that is, to my mind, the most profound and most important direction that this discussion can go. I'm delighted that you and your organization are there working on it, and I thank you for coming on the show, Nathan Newman, Director of Data Justice.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Been a pleasure. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back. This is the Zero Hour.